Hi there everyone, it's Vanessa. Here ready to film videos that I haven't been filming in probably a month. I'm gonna start with the first video that I wanted to record. It's mostly a discussion about true crime and how we aestheticize true crime sometimes. One great thing about being employed by a university library is that you get access to their catalog, and there are lots of books that are online as well. So I was just browsing around and I found this really interesting book about cereal. It's just a bunch of essays arguing different things. It takes on a bunch of different aspects of cereal as like a storytelling phenomenon. One of the essays that most interested me looks into how cereal specifically uses all of these aesthetics to appeal to us, and that made me think just a bunch more about true crime in general, because I do watch a lot of true crime documentaries and series. I do listen to true crime podcasts. I have read true crime books before. Sometimes we view true crime as a guilty pleasure. It is a genre that I feel ethically and like morally ambiguous about. There's definitely a vibe with true crime that doesn't make at least me feel like I am consuming the most responsible stories. So let's talk about some of the things that was in this essay and why do we listen to, read about, and watch true crime stories? Like, what do we gain out of it? In this essay, they talked about Laura Browder, who wrote an essay herself in another book called The Cambridge Companion to American Crime Fiction. It was all about true crime, the history of true crime, and what we get out of these stories. She argues that true crime is a popular arena for metaphysical discussions about the nature of evil, the meaning of retribution, and the impossibility of knowing another person, like, truly and fully. She focuses a lot on the beginning of her essay on Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. He really brought this new nonfiction novel idea to the true crime genre. This makes reading, and in this age of like prestige TV, watching anything that has to do with a horrible, gory crime, a respectable thing to do. This includes things that I have definitely consumed. The Jinx, Making a Murderer. Recently I watched The Keepers, definitely consuming like Serial, S-Town, and books that I've read, such as Ghettoside, Lost Girls, The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. These are all things that I've consumed and I've enjoyed while I read, listened to, or watched, but you still at the end of it feel kind of like, I don't know, like at least I feel kind of like a shitty person after I've watched all of these horrible people do all these horrible things. So let's talk more about true crime from Laura Browder's essay. She talks about how it's been around for a really long time, starting in like the 1700s, and it was a thing that even Americans really enjoyed learning about. British crime stories. By the 1900s, the genre had allowed for people to participate in moral judgment. So it was not just telling you about these horrible crimes, it was telling you, what do you think about these things? And that's one thing that is really prevalent in today's true crime as well. This was brought up in the first essay that I was talking about, the approach in Serial that invites the audience to participate. And we definitely saw this as every episode was aired once a week. The subreddit for this was super huge, and people were becoming their own detectives, quote unquote, trying to decipher all of this evidence and trying to morally judge people. Who did the wrong thing? Is Jay guilty? Is Adnan guilty? It also uses characterization, the idea of characters, and diminishing the fact that these are real people. The last thing, the NPR voice. This NPR voice also aestheticizes it. True crime has changed a lot. True crime uses factuality to kind of exculpate the guilt that we might feel by reading and listening to and consuming these kinds of stories. So they use kind of like, these are the facts, here they are. Taking them in, you're like, oh, I'm not really doing anything morally wrong because I'm just listening to like the true things that occurred. True crime also almost always has women victims and male perpetrators, and this is definitely seen in Serial, Making a Murderer, The Jinx, The Keepers, Lost Girls. Pretty much everything that I have mentioned that I have consumed has a woman victim and a male perpetrator. One thing that's really interesting to me is how they talk about the women victims, because in Serial and in Making a Murderer and in the Jinx, we rarely, if at all, hear about the victims. We get to spend very little time learning about their lives, and we are a lot more focused on the evil or the people that we suspect are the criminals. And that is like the perfect way to describe the Jinx, because literally I can't even tell you what the victim's name is, but I know Robert Durst because the whole story is centered on him and the cat and mouse relationship between the journalist and Robert Durst. I think this is in contrast to other things that I have consumed, like Lost Girls and most recently The Keepers, which focus a lot more on the victims. One thing that I really enjoyed about Lost Girls is that it focused on victims that we wouldn't necessarily read about in narratives like this. I think our society has a hard time seeing sex workers as completely human, and that they are doing this for a job and then become a victim. We don't really hear about those stories. A lot of our society thinks it's all in the kind of work that they do. They don't have to be doing these things. I think that Lost Girls really took that on in a pretty responsible way to tell the stories of women we wouldn't usually hear about and their struggles and why they are sex workers. The same with The Keepers. It's a show that I watched really recently, and it started off as this true crime story from like the 60s, and it turned into this sexual abuse scandal, and that's a whole different take on the documentary true crime series. The story was so much more centered on survivors, how we really must believe survivors. And it's also really great in my opinion because it is the survivor deciding, I want to speak up and tell my story, rather than a journalist or an outside person coming in and saying, I'm gonna do a story on this person, without really letting them speak their piece and letting them have a say in how they want to represent their story to us. So I would definitely suggest The Keepers. It is a really heartbreaking thing that occurred in a story, but I think it is so important, and it made me see how valuable it is to have women at the forefront of these kinds of stories. They have a whole different take on everything. Overall, true crime is a fascinating genre because it blends reporting and it blends our ideas about moral judgments. So it's like, yeah, we have facts, so this is real, and you feel good reading these facts because you are learning and becoming more knowledgeable. But at the same time, a lot of writers are expecting you, the reader, consumer, to take this story in and then inject your own values on it. And it tries to get you to sift through their evidence so that you can decide who's guilty and who's not, and if what happened is deserved or not. I think it just all goes back to the idea of the nature of evil, of us trying to understand why there are evil people in the world, how we will never know everybody around us, and we can never think that this person would never be capable of doing something like this. And our ideas and the meaning of retribution, we want the people who are guilty to be brought to justice. So we consume these stories to try to make sense of our world too. We want a just society. These stories are just microcosms trying to get these really tiny stories to explain our larger ideas about the world. A very interesting genre for sure, but definitely a genre that has ethical dilemmas. Thanks so much for watching my video. If you have any comments about true crime or the kind of true crime that you consume or why you think you consume true crime, leave them down below because this is a fascinating discussion in my opinion. I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.